We are live.
Thank you. Good morning. Today is Thursday, January 18th, 2024. It's 9:05 a.m. and this is the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee. We are resuming our work on Bill F-213, an act related to regulation of wetlands, river corridor development and dam safety. We spent quite a bit of time learning the science of it in the last 10 days, hearing from ANR and other folks. And now we're branching out to talk to folks who have an interest and role in regulating and managing land use and development. And so with that, especially because the river corridor piece has such an impact on towns, we wanted to hear from municipalities writ large. So Mr. Brady, you join us at the table. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. For the record, Ted Brady, I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. We represent all 247 cities and towns in the legislature and provide them, try to help them serve and strengthen municipal government, local governments. Thanks for caring about our opinions, because it does have a rather large impact on municipalities. So I appreciate being asked in. And I wanted to share kind of three perspectives today. Perspective one being, we agree with kind of what you're doing here, which is the summer flooding calls for bold action to mitigate climate change, the impacts of climate change. And so what you've proposed, I think, is bold action. So I really do appreciate that. The second thing I wanted to touch on was, I honestly think municipalities might welcome help managing development in our river corridors. So the underlying premise of at least the second section resonates with a lot of our members. You've probably heard the testimony of this building in other committees or heard of it. We hear people saying this is a lot for us to manage in our smaller towns. So thanks for hearing that and thinking about it. And then the third message I wanted to leave today with was dams are complicated beings. And remember that municipalities own a lot of somewhere around 100 or so that we have on our books. We're the property casualty insurer for municipalities and for 95% of Vermont's municipalities. And when you start talking about liability, the insurance side of our house listens. And then, so those are kind of the three things I want to touch on. Is there anything else you were hoping I'd touch on before I launch in?
No, it's really because we're talking about municipal operations in a pretty intimate way. Like, we really want to hear where we're on the mark, where we're maybe off the mark, and keep on educating ourselves about how this might be implemented. One of the questions that came up yesterday talking with ANR was a little bit less around if we do this, but sort of what would be a timeline for doing things so that things might roll out in an orderly way that maximize the likelihood of success for all the parties, and it brings a lot of different parties together.
Well, let's start at the kind of base setting of understanding why we care about it. And you've heard this already, but it's a good reminder. We think there's about $200 million of public assistance damage, eligible damage that occurred to municipal infrastructure during the July fire. That's roads, bridges, wastewater systems, town halls. I think it's safe to say that most of that damage occurred on the banks of rivers, streams, and brooks in river corridors. We have first-hand experience with these damages because not only is our federal funding assistance program actually counseling people through this process and helping them do some FEMA work, but in addition to that, as the insurer, we actually have a catalog of what's in these river corridors. And so we insure about $3 billion worth of municipal infrastructure. That doesn't include roads and bridges and culverts. It includes things like town halls, wastewater plants, vehicles, parks, things along those lines. Almost 15% of that, or what we think is about $500 million worth of municipal infrastructure sits in these river corridors and high risk flood, high hazard flood zones as identified by FEMA. And we think that number is actually underrepresented because FEMA hasn't updated those maps, right? And so when FEMA does update those maps, we think that $3 billion, a bigger portion of that $3 billion will be eaten by it. I bring this all up just to say what you're proposing here has an enormous impact on the built infrastructure that exists. You know, a lot of our municipalities are in these areas that you are proposing to have the state take control over. A lot of the future growth potential exists in these places. We all know that roads and settlements are generally in the valleys of rivers, streams, and brooks by ease of development, easier to develop there than on the side of the mountain. That said, we think municipalities are open to the conversation about somebody else helping with managing in these river corridors. This flies in the face of a central tenet of VLCT's municipal policy, right? Which is local control. And I think the reality is the goal of coordinating the regulation development of river corridors, recognizing that waterways don't respect municipal boundaries. And therefore, it would make sense that the upstream and downstream impacts of development should be considered, and that might not be best left to a single municipality. And we're really lucky that we have partners like the regional planning commissions that can help with this. They already do help with this, and they do help think about more than just a municipality when they help municipalities put together their plans. However, we think there might be a better way. I specifically appreciate in 213 that you folks have already considered the fact that there are some towns that have the capability of managing the complex reality of this. And so that delegated authority provision is really appreciated. There are a few other things that we specifically hope you'll consider as you adjust the draft bill. First, any centralization must create multiple opportunities for municipalities to weigh in, challenge, or support how the state regulates river corridor management. Talk about where development occurs. My understanding is the bill specifically tries to allow for, I don't want to call them exemptions, but acknowledging that the designated centers are perhaps places that we're going to have to allow some development to occur in. You know, a designated center is a pretty small place, so appreciate ways to think about larger settlement patterns than just those designated centers. But also, if the state's going to create an app, the state's going to enforce permits in these places. That underlying map and those permits need to have a lot of municipal buy-in and a lot of opportunities for municipalities to challenge maps and provide feedback to those maps. And as they change, municipalities should continue to have that. So it's not a one and done. The other thing that I would encourage is that regional planning commissions are, I appreciate that one's already testified and two others are testifying today after me, that they really should be empowered to have a larger say in that state process also. They generally are made up of municipal officials who sit on their boards, right? So really appreciate anything you can do to incorporate the opinion of RPCs. And then finally, the big concern we have, this is a dirty secret of municipal government, right? The state's getting a really good deal on anything they ask municipalities to do. You have volunteers and people who are paid less than state officials and do not receive state benefits doing the work for you. Anytime you take a responsibility away from the municipality and give it to the state, it will cost more than you think it will. And all of the dirty secrets of how people stay up until midnight after they go to work, doing the work of government, will be gone, and it becomes a paid responsibility of somebody who you have to pay $50 an hour plus benefits and God knows what else. And that's the reality of making, a proposal like this. You are freeing municipalities of a burden that is of great value to the state. And it's a dirty secret of municipal government. Free labor.
Is wage theft.
But it's affordable. It is a civic duty, right? People see it as a civic duty, which is a beautiful thing of American democracy. So my final point was about dams. And we insure dams, so we actually have a list of municipally owned dams, there's about 100 of them. About a quarter of them are uninsurable. We insure the downstream effects of when a dam, failure occurs, not the dam itself, the dam itself is on the municipality. We rely on the state's condition reports for making determinations about our insurable dams. As you've heard, a lot of those reports are old, right? A lot of those are not up to date, and it makes it really hard for us to understand the risk that our towns are assuming. So just like to warn that changing liability provisions around dams is complicated. There is not a insurance market that insures the impacts of dam failures. So by changing liability, you are opening up the taxpayers of Vermont to a significant potential liability. That's a big policy decision, but really, most importantly in my mind, is there really are very few places municipalities can go to get help fixing their dams. And a lot of these are not functionally, are not, flood dams or something. There's a lot of reasons that municipalities own dams. But the one thing that they all have in common is there's not a place to find money to help them fix these dams. And so, like all municipal infrastructure, it's on the backs of that tiny little piece of property tax that we get to charge once the ed fund's done eating our lunch. Just appreciate that the revolving loan fund is being changed a little bit, but it's another piece of municipal infrastructure that's underfunded. So with that, thanks for the time. Happy to answer any questions. And appreciate that you even care what we think.
So selling license plates is the viable funding.
Perhaps for a portion of one dam, very small bit.
And they get to use them over again without having to pay for them for any second time.
I thought I had to pay for my vanity plate every year.
Mayor Watson.
Thank you. I am intrigued by this statistic that a quarter of municipal dams are uninsurable. So that's because they're in such poor condition that, that you won't, because I assume they're insured through you all, that you won't take them on. And so no one is taking them on as insured liability.
Sure.
And so are those dams, I'm guessing there's no, I don't know if there's any way to prioritize those dams for removal or for repair, I guess this is an open question. I don't know if you would know if there's prioritization for taking care of those presumably high risk dams.
Should be careful how you speak. I know that about a quarter of the municipal dams we don't insure. Many of those are because the condition of them just wouldn't justify putting the risk on.
Sure, on your.
And I do know that that we have these reports from the state that say what condition the dams are in, and so there's absolutely a way to prioritize which dams are in the worst shape.
Yeah, but okay. But they're not necessarily being prioritized, right, there's a way to prioritize them, but they're not necessarily being prioritized.
Not that I'm aware of. I'm afraid I'm not an expert.
That's okay.
We can follow up with some
No
more
worries.
from, especially, I'd love to submit additional information from our risk management team that actually deals with the dams on a daily basis.
One of the things that we talked about yesterday with Secretary Moore was, is this potential for a phased in approach? And one of the first steps was to create a standard statewide model flood area policy. And I'm curious for which would be taking away the local control without necessarily maybe there would be some support along with it, but it doesn't, exactly relieve the municipalities of that responsibility altogether. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely, it's just who gets to make the model policy. And so the league makes a lot of model policies. They take whatever you put in statute, conflicts of interest, open meeting law, you go down the list and we'll make a model policy with input from municipal lawyers. And give them a model policy. So we'd encourage you to consider, if that were an approach, make sure the RPCs and the municipalities are invited in a process with ANR to make that model policy.
Great, thank you.
So, yeah, following up from Kendra Watson's question, so that, it's interesting that, you have a sense of a quarter of the dams are uninsurable. Can you send any more information to the committee? I'm just trying to better understand what's out there. We did ask, by way of reassurance to everyone in the room and maybe listening, we asked ANR yesterday to look at, dam condition and dam risk. And where is the portion of that Venn diagram that's poorest condition and highest risk, so that we have a strategy for prioritizing. But it'd be nice to lay that information up against what you're seeing at the municipal level and what's being reported to you.
I'd have to talk to the risk management team about what data is public.
Yeah.
I'd love to share whatever I can with you, and I'll work on that afterwards. And also, our information is derived from ANR's.
Yeah.
So ANR would have DEC, right, would have the same information we have, but I could, let me work on trying to figure out how I can share that information with you.
Right, I don't want to ask you all to do something duplicative, and if it's entirely based on DEC evaluations, then that they wouldn't have it. So that boots on the ground firsthand knowledge that might be more detailed or even more up to date than what they have. And the part of all this is not only related to strategy, but helping estimate what kind of revolving loan fund, how it needs to be capitalized, both initially and on an ongoing basis to make it affordable for entities to go ahead and make the repairs necessary, or dam removals. Do you get requests from your members saying, can you help us understand how we would remove a dam or funds eligible for removal? Or is that not much of your?
It's not much of our portfolio,
Yeah.
right? I have not heard that request in the 3 years I've been here, but I wouldn't know if it's something ever. I haven't heard it. I haven't heard that.
On the mapping side, you're talking about maps, but any process that state-led should include the munis and the RPCs, which I think we would be ensuring in however it was, the statute was constructed. But can you say a little bit about what resources you would bring to bear that might lead to a different conclusion than what DEC might see? I don't know. I'm imagining it as a science-based decision, but I'm trying to understand what you might see that DEC might not see that would suggest to you the map ought to be drawn a little differently.
Yeah, I think the dozens of planning and zoning officials that are on the ground in each of these communities, many of whom are highly educated, highly degreed people in land use planning, natural resource planning, would add value to a process. Would be able to say, well, your statistical analysis may say this, but here's how it actually is working with flood. FEMA maps are out of date. All maps generally become out of date within a couple of years of being published. And so to have that local input would be really important to say, this is actually what's happening on the ground in my community. The other reality is that I don't think we have an ability to make a completely science-based decision.
Sure.
Because if we did, we'd have to level a lot of communities that were built before the science was understood. And so I think any process ANR leads is going to be a political process. And to allow the input from local political angles, I think will be really important.
So we're, in a lot of our conversation so far is like going forward. But I'm wondering, even if outside of this bill, what happens, what kind of level of support do municipalities receive from the state along the lines of this planning? I mean, it's not a new topic to have the bylaws that help you then qualify for FEMA, our National Flood Insurance Program. And I don't have a very clear sense of, the municipalities feel generally well supported by the state. You call, technicians arrive, help you do mapping, write vitals, can you say a little bit about what kind of help you get currently?
Sure, I think the biggest help we get is in the form of regional planning commissions. That's gonna be the first call that a municipality makes. Probably not going to be looking up the DEC contact first. It'll likely be to the RBC to say, who do I talk to about this? And yes, the state absolutely shows up and gives technical expertise. The state gives very little financial assistance to the municipalities, most of it sits at the Agency of Commerce and Community Development in the world's smallest planning commission of CP&R and ACCD. But a lot of what we depend on is in the planners that sit at the regional planning commission level. I do not mean to diminish the state employees who respond to the questions after the RPC connects them and gives people good data and gets out in the field. There are plenty of those, but the first call is usually to the RPC.
Great, I don't have any other questions. Any other committee questions for Mr. Brady? I was waiting for you as a former mayor to have some very tantalizing questions.
Oh, no, I sympathize with the perspective, so.
Your offices, did they go under water right there, or are they just high enough?
Within an inch,
Okay.
Gosh.
so really lucky.
Yeah.
Senator McCormick,
Do you have any changes in the language? Well, that you
I don't yet, I don't have specific language changes. If you're open to them, I think we work with the RPCs as the partners to come back specifically around what areas on the map would allow development, even though they might not, even though they're in the river corridor, there's designated areas, changing that language. I think changing language in how how ANR has to put this together to specifically require municipal input and RPC input, I think would be where I focus. And in the liability section on dams, I'd love to talk to my risk management service folks and ask them to provide some feedback.
thanks, Senator McCormick, for that question. Yeah, if you could, I'm hoping that in about 3 weeks, this bill will be out. So if you can start putting it together and drafting suggested language, either formal drafting or, just suggestions for how different strategies, either way, so that will be. Senator Watson.
Thank you. I have, and I want to recognize that this is an impossible question. But
Thanks.
yeah, no problem. But I just want to put it out there that one of the things that we are wrestling with is this how to capitalize the dams revolving loan fund. And so like where are we going to find some money to do that? So the impossible question really is just like, if you have any suggestions, like where we can find, like where you think it ought to come from, that would be welcome.
If you don't have an answer to that,
Yeah, right.
would appreciate that,
Yeah.
and we'll put our heads together.
Yeah, just something to pin. I mean, we have some ideas, but they're not gonna be popular, right? Like with anybody, of course. But just thinking about the logic of like who benefits, who's responsible, who ought to participate in helping to fund that. Like that's kind of where my logic is going as to how to answer that question. So, yeah. Thank you.
We asked the secretary, I alluded to it the other day, with community reporting the old papers, is I found my 2018, I think, report, or maybe it's even earlier, from the treasurer, then Treasurer Pierce, when we were trying to fund the Clean Water Fund. And she wrote a lengthy report on ways we might fund it, and it included a chart, and I'll make copies and bring it in about like 17 different ways of looking at, what's the nexus between the activity and the funding source and all sorts of sustainability. And I'll bring that in as quick.
I'd love to see that.
Help us start thinking about what would make sense.
That'd be great.
Senator McCormick, do you have another one?
No,
Right.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Brady. Good to see you again.
So,
With that, Mr. Baker. think this is your first time formally in committee this time, so good to see you as well.
Good morning, thank you. Yeah, for the record, Charlie Baker, I'm the executive director of the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission. Also chair our state association's government relations committee, so I am spending a little bit more time in the state house maybe than normal. But that's good, most days. I don't have any specific written suggestions for you yet. I think I appreciate all Ted's comments and I agree with everything he said, so I'll just kind of start with that. And sometimes that happens. And then secondly, I want to kind of make a broader point about I think this is the bill so far is trying to get at this, but maybe there needs to be one section that kind of elevates the analysis of our watersheds with respect to flooding, right? Which would look at the wetlands, look at the floodplains, look at the river corridors, look at the dams all together as a system. So this is kind of a weakness that we have right now. We haven't really, we have kind of some specific maps and we look at pieces, but not the whole system to figure out the best way to address flooding. And, we know that we need to provide spaces for the activate floodplains upstream, right, to reduce impacts on downstream communities. And as Ted said, it's not one town at a time, it's more of a watershed examination. We do, I'm using the royal we, the state, we do basin planning now, right, but it's very focused on water quality. So I don't know if, while we're looking at that watershed, if there's, and I know that's following some federal guidance, and there is no federal guidance around this beyond the NFIP program. So maybe it may be some sort of addendum to the basin plan, like while we're looking at the basin plan for water quality, we could also look at quantity and flooding as part of that, because sometimes solutions actually have water quality benefits too, if we're doing floodplain work. So that's one broad suggestion. And related to that, I think, as we look at those things, and, I think Ted started making this point, I was reminded of, I think we were sitting in this chair 12 years ago in the session after Irene and talking about river corridor regulation and whether we should do it or not. And, we ended up with a voluntary program that, has been pretty ineffective, I think, statewide. And I don't say that to disparage anyone. I think it's just kind of a reality of the system that we have. And just I try not to do this too often, but on the Chittenden County side, we have not been getting as much flood damage in Chittenden County. But one of the reasons, we're flatter, but also our towns had river buffers in their zoning probably 30 years ago, like as soon as very early on. So we don't have, as a percentage basis, as many structures in the floodplains. So it's, and I say that just to kind of emphasize the point, it's really critical that we get structures out of floodplains where we can, and floodproof where we can. So there is more work that needs to happen there. So moving to the river corridors.
Sorry,
Yeah.
just a question about that. So there's a lot of the greatest pressure we hear about in terms of development these days is around housing.
Yep.
And I'm just wondering if you're in your time at the RPC or in the Chittenden County, did you end up facing pressure to develop in areas that are floodplain and you had the mapping or the willpower to say, no, we're not going there, but.
Yeah, and by and large, our towns, and this is, I guess, the kind of says in the point I was trying to make, our towns have largely regulated development out of the floodplains decades ago. So the answer to that is no. It's just because it wasn't really an option the towns were even open for. And to follow up on the river corridor, this idea of, state regulation is certainly something, and I support what Ted said, this is not happening by and large in our municipalities. and even the floodplain regulation enforcement, almost all our towns have floodplain ordinances or bylaws, but, you know, the enforcement is inconsistent, I'll say. And so, you know, I think there is a role for the state to play, and, I did note the testimony yesterday about, you know, might be 15 to 20 positions. And I'm hoping we can think a little bit more creatively about how to get there, and phase it in. As Ted noted, one of the compromises that came out of 2012 was that RPCs would have a staff person who was trained as a certified floodplain manager. So there's a training certification that you get, related to floodplain regulation. And so, you know, we're trying to support the lack of municipal capacity and also just realistic expectations. Not every municipality can get that involved in that piece of regulation. And so we do provide some support. We have a trained person on staff. And I wonder if there's some sort of system that can be worked out with DEC where the RPC staffer could do kind of an initial review or something, kind of ease the burden. So maybe DEC doesn't have to hire, you know, 20 people, they could hire a few. And we could do an initial review of, you know, how it's complying with the regulations, you know, and they make the decision.
So just to make sure I remember, so there are 9 RPTs? 11.
I think probably should start off with the introduction on all that.
And each of them now have a floodplain manager.
I think so. It was a requirement of the state for a while. I'm not sure the state is requiring us to do that anymore, so we may not have 11 anymore, but that is the intent. I think we do, but I'm not sure. I guess someone.
If you could check, that would be helpful. I mean,
Yeah.
especially just for the point you're making back there.
Yeah.
It's part of thinking of potential transition plans or ways to sort of let out the clutch as you go from 0 to 20 people.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem like it would get funded, and it would seem like a very hard thing to stand up for all of us.
Thank you. I am intrigued by this idea of how, as a potential step to phase in this transition. When you say have the RPC staff, who's the floodplain manager and certified to do that, I think that is really valuable and we should absolutely capitalize on that and like honor those people that are certified to do this work. When you say do an initial review, can you flesh that out a little bit?
Sure, the analogy I'll use is, and different RPCs may do this a little differently, but we've had the occasion where one of our towns has lost their zoning administrator.
Yeah.
Right? And so we'll get a call like, can you help us out for a little while? But we don't want to have a regulatory relationship with our municipalities. Right? And so what we've worked out with the you know, several times we've done this is we'll have a staff review the proposed development for consistency with the town's bylaws.
Mhm.
But we kind of say, but town administrator or whoever, maybe it's a planning director, somebody in the town, you're the decision maker.
Mhm.
We're gonna give you a report with like how it complies with your regulations, and you can review that and you make the final decision. We're basically drafting it for you.
Mhm.
And so something akin to that seems like it might work, and as Ted noted, we're all kind of getting these calls from municipalities anyway.
Mm.
Even with the municipal system, base system we have now. And so we're kind of providing that same advice to municipalities. We could provide that advice to a state decision maker instead of the municipality. That's not really a huge level of work beyond what we're already doing. And I'm this is a little bit of a half-baked thought, which I have not vetted with my peers.
Love them.
But it was, you know, at least 10 minutes ago, you know. Yeah, and I wasn't proposing it as a transitional thing. I think it just as a way to reduce the demand on staff hiring at the state. I was thinking that could be the
Permanent.
system. which allows us to be, kind of work closer with our municipalities, and support them. Back to go upstream, sorry,
Oh.
I know, sorry. But in the rulemaking, the rulemaking is gonna be incredibly important on this. And to your question about like, the science base.
Yeah.
Even when, DEC was coming out with the initial river corridor, there was an acknowledgement, like they're doing a GIS level, like kind of statewide, so. They want to do some more ground truthing, and I think that was a point that Ted made, and that's why we do need that kind of municipal regional input into that process. That's on the map, but also how the map is used is going to be a big point of discussion, right? And so, and I don't know all the details on that now, right? Simplistically, I go, let's just prevent everything from happening there. I don't know if that works all the time. We do have communities that are centered on our rivers. And so it's kind of like, okay, well, what can happen in those places and exactly how can they happen? If they're gonna happen. That needs to be worked through, and I don't have the answer for that at the moment. But it would be, getting some guidance in the bill, in the statute to DEC on rulemaking, so that is kind of clear and concise. I think Chris Anthony was in here last week. And kind of mentioned our experience with the clean water service providers. They are still not done with the guidance on that, and that was, I don't know when the clean water service provider got set up, 2019, I think.
Yeah.
I think we're into the 5th year.
Quite a long time ago.
Yeah, and so, and apologies to our friends at DEC, but we just need to go through rulemaking in a period of time and be done. So we can move on, because having processes that go on that long are just not constructive to the system.
Well, it's the irony of the clean water service provider strategy was that was, I think, going to expedite and make more, potentially more fair distribution of funds. So, but if the mechanism to do that is becoming an obstacle in and of itself.
And it's a voluntary programming, like we volunteered to help, like it's, if anything, I didn't want to talk about that. Now, we can talk about that another time. And also, as you're thinking about both the wetlands, river corridor floodplain regulations, and Ted made this point also, is tying it to the type of place it is, we may require different standards. So that's, in our centers and the places we're trying to encourage, well, there may be some accommodation, and Ted also noted that the designated centers, I mean, they're 0.3% of our land area. That may not be the full geography that needs to be accommodated there. So the work that we've done for Act 250, which we'd love to talk to you about also, we've looked at all the land use categories in the state and trying to get more of a system. So maybe tying into that a little bit, if you let that moves forward in the Act 250 work, there might be something to tie onto there.
That's a good prompt for me to mention that tomorrow we'll be putting on our active 50 hats and hearing from members of the NRB team that wrote that NRB report that is titled Natural Resources for Necessary Update Act.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to go off on that.
No,
Yeah.
I always think there's a relationship.
Yeah, there's a relation, and frankly, and I think on the wetlands section of the bill, I did want to make this point of like, the wetlands right now, the way it's regulated, doesn't differentiate in terms of where it's located. And so, we just have had, particularly I've seen in my region, situations where we have a wetland in kind of a developed area, but, and we're also managing stormwater. And it's kind of tied into the wetland, but the buffer rules, it doesn't quite, from a scientific sense, doesn't seem to make sense requiring these buffers and things when we're trying to do the best stormwater treatment. And have the development fit in there. So again, some ability to flex a little bit, even as we encourage redevelopment. Like you want to get, stormwater regs and floodplain reg, you want to get more protections in here. So you need to have a little bit of a way to accommodate redevelopment or reinvestment in properties. that makes sense. So I think I will,
Sorry to interrupt,
oh, yeah.
can you say a little more, I mean, I'm not sure I understand fully what you mean, like, when you're looking at wetlands and you're also stormwater and you're also considering development, how you, all the things you have to think through in an integrated way, but I'm not sure how that plays out, like,
Yeah.
what are you weighing and how are you coming up with a solution?
And I think mostly I've heard this from like the stormwater folks, maybe Tom DePietro in South Burlington, like, you know, if they want to do a stormwater treatment for what's happening, you know, adjacent to the wetland, and it's kind of the natural place for that to occur, it's kind of in the buffer. But then they're prevented from doing anything in the buffer. And so, I just, you know, in those locations where we're kind of in a pretty developed area, I'm sure that's makes the best sense. And I say that the stormwater regs also, like, you know, to be able to encourage redevelopment and things. I worry that if we're being too strict and treating everything like a greenfield, people are avoiding redeveloping their property and making some environmental improvement because they can't get to the highest environmental improvement, right? So I think, yeah, so we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good in these cases, right? So I will leave it at that, and look forward to coming back and talking with you more on Act 250 and maybe clean water sewage providers.
Sarah?
Thank you, Chair Bray, and apologies, I realize you're just doing like a wrap up bit there, but I do have one question. Again, apologies, I had to present a bill on health and welfare, so I missed. And I thought you were coming tomorrow, so great, this is awesome. But so we had a point made by the administration, and perhaps you've already responded to it, but specifically on dam safety, and I think in general, they feel that rulemaking, the timeline is good enough. That where we are in rulemaking is a quick enough timeline to meet the needs post flood. And I would put forward that I disagree with that. I think that the likelihood of another flood is so great that we need to expedite a process, and legislatively, that's how we could accomplish it. I'm wondering if you can speak to if you feel, or the organizations you represent, if you feel that rulemaking is moving quick enough, and if we should rely on it for this set of proposals, or if we should, we should move forward in a quicker way.
I'm not familiar with the dam rulemaking process, and so I'm not sure I'm the best person to speak on that.
Okay, we have other, in general, you spoke about rulemaking.
Yeah.
Would you mind sharing some thoughts on, do you think that an 18-month timeline is expeditious enough?
I think if you're actually going to engage affected parties, that probably is a realistic timeline. If you asked me how long it's gonna take, I probably would have said 12 to 18 months. And so, yeah, always pushing for 12. But to actually engage all the parties and do a meaningful process around that, I think it's gonna take that long. And sorry, the thing I was complaining about was kind of guidance and stretching out for several years after the fact.
So I think that is my underlying fear, is
Yeah.
that we will not see it occur in even the timeline that we've been given. So that was, you picked up on what my concern was and you had highlighted it, but I really respect that you are honest in your feedback, that maybe 18 months actually is a very expedited time, so thank you.
Yeah, and because, I mean, I think the flip side is you don't want to short circuit the engagement.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah, and make, you know, and miss important things to consider, so, yeah, thank you for asking.
Especially when that engagement involves rounds of comments and then a response from the agency, then a response from the affected parties to the responses. And I mean, in a healthy way, it can take a couple loops around that circle. To sort things out. I'm wondering if you would, I mentioned to Mr. Brady, if you, and he was saying, I partner with you on this a little bit, if you can put down your thoughts in writing in terms of where we might make improvements to the bill and start helping us think about language changes and it's the bill, that would be really.
Happy to do that. I'll work with Tasha on that. Can you do more comments?
So we're open to all parties contributing, so thank you very much.
So,
And that, moving on to Ms. Hall, good to see you again.
Hey,
You
good
join us.
See you.
Introduce yourself to the committee. I don't know that everyone here has met you yet. So.
No, hi, Asha Wallace, Executive Director of the Lamoille County Planning Commission. It's nice to see you all. Some of you have seen me in multiple different incarnations over the years. Yes, so thank you.
Good to be flexible and provide.
Yes, yes. And I really appreciate, the time today. I do agree with what Charlie had said. I may regret that later, but yeah, I'm happy to support them. And, I'm here to speak as, the representative of the regional planning commissions, but also from the Lamoille County. So now in Lamoille County, we have narrow river valleys and steep slopes. And we had terrible flooding in July, as did, many other areas of the state. And, Johnson Village, as an example, had about 8 feet of water in their grocery store that still isn't reopened. They had similar amounts of water in their sewage treatment plant. They're currently operating a temporary plant. They're borrowing money and burning through it like mad, and it's just very distressing to see the pressures on these very small communities. And what's also very concerning is we had the December flooding,
Yes.
and the December flooding was the 4th highest river level reported in Johnson Village. And so we know the world is changing, and it's changing quickly. I had an order of things to say, but during the testimony, some things came up, but the chair asked about the issue of pressures to develop in flood locations. I will say that when we're working with the small communities, one thing we're finding is that so many of the existing programs, whether they're FEMA or anything else, they're designed to put things back exactly where they were. And that's a pressure and an approach that I really think we need to start thinking differently about. I don't know that wastewater treatment plant should stay where it is, should we put millions and millions of dollars into keeping it right next to the river and facing the fear of inundation. But it's a big heavy lift to get FEMA to a different place, so I think that's
Can we talk on that? So I wanna make sure I really understand. So, is it always the case, often the case, like how, and what programs are we talking about in terms of, they say we, you could build back better, but it needs to be in the same place.
Well, I think there's the issue of FEMA, the structure very much to put it back in the same place. And then the challenges of moving something, the permitting, the Act 250, the local permitting, all these things can take a long time and create barriers to moving things. And so we need to really think about all these processes very holistically.
But I think I asked the question a little bit in the wrong way. I said build back better in the same place. Sometimes I know on culverts, and sometimes there's problems, issues with you need to replace. I hope we resolve this, but being told you can replace the culvert you had engineered to the same level, you can't enhance it to make it more floodproof, like because that's an improvement as opposed to a replacement. Have we sorted that one out since?
We are better at that. We have to go through a benefit cost analysis. And that, one of the things that we have found, we've done a lot of hydrological modeling of Lamoille River, but quite often when working with the feds, they ask us to use old FEMA maps, which really don't reflect reality. And that's another challenge. But I am digressing a little bit from the bill, so.
Sure.
But I do think that that's something to consider. You asked a question, Mr. Chair, about the rulemaking process and the river corridors and the floodplain administration. And I really wanted to weigh in on that issue about what the RPCs have to contribute in that process. Currently, the RPCs have a contract with the Agency of Natural Resources to work with all the towns around the state that are getting new FEMA flood maps to assist those communities in updating their bylaws. And that's a tremendous process. And we are working with the agency. And I noticed that the bill specifically talks about the state establishing flood hazard bylaw standards. And what we have found in some communities is to meet the national flood protection rules, a town needs to do X. And A&R sometimes comes in and says you should do X and Y. And instead of doing X, the town blocks and say, wow, that's so much, we don't want to do anything. And so I think it's so important that the towns and the regional planning commissions are at the table so that when we're talking about updating bylaws, when we're talking about river borders, we're doing it in a way that works for the parties involved. You know, towns like to work with the state, not have things presented to them.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That could be the quote for so many topics with towns. Could you describe a little bit more of the reason why the pushback is happening? Is it, from my understanding, and perhaps Mr. Kennedy described it, but it seems like it's just staffing and resources, and that's the main pushback. Is it sounds like your description of X is a lower barrier and then Y might be a slightly higher barrier or more work. So it seems like just the gap between we're doing so much already, we don't have the staffing capacity is the main issue. But perhaps I'm wrong in that assumption.
But I think there are other factors involved as well, and communities are all very different. And I think communities accept that that they should abide by the standards of the law, but some choose to exceed what those standards are and some don't. And I think that, and maybe it was Charlie who talked about the perfect being the enemy of good. And we need to find that place which is a good and which protects these communities.
Thank you.
On the river corridors, I do think that, and I'm not sure if you've read some of the testimony from the municipal officials and Senate gov ops, but clearly.
We may.
Yeah, yeah. I gotta look at my work chart, but it is a challenge and it hasn't worked and it's hard for these towns to adopt these standards. But if we are going to turn it over to A&R, I don't think it needs to be something that works for the towns and the regional planning commissions, and we all have to be involved. Some of the towns still are not super happy with the way river corridors, even though it was voluntary, rolled out for, because there were lines on a map, they weren't ground truth everywhere. And we really need to have a process that the product that is put forth by the state is something that people feel they can comment on, that they can refine, and that they have some ownership of to. I do feel strongly about the designated areas versus existing settlements. Just because I served on the downtown board, I think in 4 different capacities, and the designated centers. And some of the villages, it's 3 buildings at Crossroads, it is not the community. And so I think it's so important that if we are going to have this river corridor, we have to exempt the existing settlements. And those existing settlements that have flooded fully understand. They know what the risk is, and they know where they want to develop and where they don't. And some of them are really rethinking about where they want stuff to be. But it is really, really hard to move a village or parts of a village up a hill. It takes a lot, especially with all the infrastructure we have.
Sarah McCormick.
You talked about a few minutes back, I didn't want to interrupt, the FEMA being willing to pay for replacement costs, but not for upgrades.
Right.
If, for example, municipality wants to, a culvert fails, they want to put in a bigger culvert.
Right.
Does FEMA refuse pay, will FEMA at least pay for the value of what was destroyed? And that town is on the hook for the rest, or does FEMA refuse to pay for anything?
No, there is a process to get FEMA to pay for an upgraded culvert. We had an incident in a small community where the cost benefit process actually led to a culvert that was much bigger than the community anticipated. It was a big concrete box, and then we had trouble implementing that because it was so big and exceeded their expectations. So I think the answer is, things are possible, but the process is excruciating. And I'll give you an example of the FEMA process. So in the village of Jacksonville, which is in the town of Cambridge, as you know, we worked on a home elevation. We've done a number of very large flood mitigation projects in the community. The home elevation took over 8 years, with the property owner carrying the cost over that time. And we had a lot of disputes with FEMA about some very basic issues, such as, does wood count as a fuel source? You know, right? Can you elevate the wood piles? So I think that everyone's trying to do the best they can in a very complex bureaucratic situation. And so when we're talking about flood standards and FEMA and A&R, it's so important that the towns have the support of the regional planning commissions, and people are going to advocate for what makes sense rather than what is super complicated or what is over the top. Because A&R, I think they've done, you know, we work closely with the river folks and they're terrific, but they're also super overextended. You know, Rebecca Pfeiffer was actually from town to town after the flooding, and it really just, they are under-resourced for this work.
When you say excruciating, so,
I mean, excruciating.
sorry, I'm not really looking for horror stories exactly, but is it, does FEMA have staff that are here steadily enough so they kind of get how Vermont works? Or is it that we get people from away who just don't necessarily have a good sense of, how towns manage themselves,
Right.
or you mentioned wood piles, you know?
Right, right. You know, I think the best thing, we might have somebody from Vermont Emergency Management here, because kudos to them. They are incredibly capable and incredibly patient. They are kind of our, you know, interloper and working with FEMA. And I think it's important that this river corridor work isn't just environmental work, it's like safety work. And I think that's an important element of it, as we get these discussions.
Some phenomenal quotes this morning.
Well, thank you, I didn't write them down.
Thank you. I'm interested in your thoughts on the suggestion that we just heard about having folks from the RPCs perhaps eventually take over the some aspect of the management of the floodplain river corridor.
Right, I am really open to that. What's important to us is that, we work with our towns on that in a positive way, you know, so often we work with our town, for instance, on writing their town plans. And we try and help them understand what you have to do to meet statute without trying to guide their particular decision making. And so, I don't want to end up being the regulator, but I want to end up being really assistance in a positive way. And Charlie had mentioned the 11 RPCs having certified floodplain managers. With turnover, we don't have one, but we have staff who's training. So we don't, I know we don't have it, but we and I think that this if we're talking about moving something from the towns to the state, it does seem to make sense to include the 3 levels of entities who are involved in all of these items.
I'm want to be sensitive to the question, and not have anyone read it the wrong way. You find that you play sort of an intervening role so that you are seen by towns as more sort of sympathetic to their particularized interests than the state is, and so that you are a liaison to the state, and you play some sort of mediating role sometimes, or is what the state says, that's the law, and so it's just a question of we may be helping to interpret it for municipalities.
I think a liaison is a good description, and I think the being a liaison works in both directions. Because I think it's sometimes very helpful when if all the RPC directors have heard very similar messages from our towns about a regulation or a program and say, this is what we're hearing on the ground, can we all talk about doing it better?
Any other committee questions for Ms. Wong?
Can I also have talk about Yamsa wetlands? Is that okay?
No,
Yeah.
please,
Belongs right into the river corridor.
Yeah.
And I only just had a couple of things on that.
we're not in a rush, no?
Okay,
I
yeah,
just-
what do you have to? No, I won't. Whatever.
When we get ready, I'll let you know.
You're right, okay. I just did wanna, point out, and I don't have language relating to this or whatever, but I wanted to remind the committee relative to the wetlands that in our county, these narrow river valleys, there's a lot of ag fields and prime ag soil that would also be really good wetlands. And so, I think it's important for A&R, and Ag Department to talk about how do we make that decision, there are some fields that due to previous Act 250 permits where you have to do some mowing and stuff as part of the prime ag soil mitigation, but maybe they should go back to being natural wetlands, It's just something to, I think, really explore, and I think it's something that we could look at in a number of rural parts of the state.
Yes, there's some very large cornfield along the river, up where
Yeah.
you are, right?
Yes, in fact, there's a road in Cambridge called Pumpkin Harbor, there's apparently named once when somebody's pumpkins washed up on the road many years ago.
Do you hear conversation about the openness to that sort of conversion? I mean, like, from the farm community, for instance, that may prefer to be in production. On the other hand, at a certain point, if you have crop damage repeatedly enough, you might think time to change how that lands.
Yeah, I think the conversation's important.
Yeah.
I don't know how it plays out, but the conversation, and we have, a fairly significant farming community in Lemuel that is constantly in transition. Around my home, I was surrounded by dairy farms when we moved there, and that's just not the case with so many other places. But yeah, so I just wanted to raise that in terms of the wetlands, it's looking at, and likewise, we have done, like in Cambridge, we replaced the bridge over the Brewster River. I don't know if you guys have seen this one, it used to hang low in the river, and when the river flooded, it would back up the water into the community. And so we did some benching underneath the flood, but it's possible if you're doing flood mitigation measures like the stormwater that Charlie mentioned, you might be approaching the buffer of the wetland or the wetland. And thinking about if there are certain types of projects that you might treat differently in the wetlands, whether it's one-to-one or some other approach.
On conversion of farmland to wetlands. Who leads that conversation typically in the community? Is it the A&R as a result of looking at mapping and flood data, that here's regular flooding, here's an opportunity for new wetlands that would mitigate damage and there's an approach. Like who, I don't know, who's looking out for that and then who's leading it?
So the answer is there's a whole bunch of different parties and in different contexts. You know, the preservation, putting a field in, prime ag soil mitigation might be a result of an Act 250 permit. But that may never have been explored, putting it in the wetlands. And so it, you know, and people who are interested in wetlands restoration are working on that angle. So I just think there needs to be communication to see if there is opportunity.
Do we ever have primate soils that were observed as a result of an offset development? And now they're prohibited from being converted to a wetland because they need to save primate soils.
I think that there are some soils in that case, and think about it, you have primate soils along a river because the river floods, leaves the sediment, leaves growth, everything, so. I don't have an answer to this issue, but I do think it's something interesting to explore. We're always looking at things like flood storage. And Charlie had mentioned the technical basin planning. I think that's a tremendous opportunity for this discussion, whether we're talking about natural resources preservation or flooding issues. You know, we work closely with the A&R tactical basin planners. I think that's really the only time when the state is really looking at a river as a watershed. And so we should be looking at that watershed in terms of the flooding too. And flooding, especially like when you got a sewage treatment plant that's inundated, can cause tremendous phosphorus releases. So I think it falls very much within the mission of the tactical basin. And I think that that's where we need to go, is looking at our rivers holistically. You know, we were very excited to sit down with one of our communities yesterday, who said, we flood a lot, but we want to meet with you and the other communities along the river and understand what we can do for them and what they can do for us. And that's, you know, we've been talking about the states and we've been talking about municipalities, but the river corridors are really part of the tactical basin, and we should be thinking about them holistically.
Music to our ears.
And which takes us to the dams, so, we're not very involved in dams, we don't own any dams like communities, and so. It would be great to get up to speed on the dam inspections, because we have communities asking us. Can any of the dams along the Lamoille be used for flood storage in any way? Can they be modified for flood storage? Can they help in that manner? And you can't get a really good read on if you can put a freeboard on top of the dam if you don't know if it's sound. So we are very supportive of looking at catching up on the inspections so that we can at least explore looking at our dams.
It's interesting to think about modifying and impound more water, as so much of the conversations been about removing dams to allow for more natural movement of water, so.
Right, but we have, yeah, sorry.
Right, can go either way, and you're the first person that I've heard that said, well, we might want to actually hold more, so. All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could you describe, when you get a question from a municipality or maybe even a private, if you do a private landowner who might have a dam on their property, what is your next step? Who do you contact?
Well, it really depends on what the question is.
Okay, if, let's say I guess what I'm trying to get at is, it seems like there may be a slight disconnect and lack of staffing at the state level to meet the needs for some of these questions. So I'm wondering if you have a source that you typically go to for questions, or if you feel that you don't have a resource that you can rely on.
Well, I'll have to admit that we're lucky in Lamoille that the head of Morrisville Water Light is Scott Johnstone, who used to be the secretary of A&R. So if he has questions about a dam, he can probably answer it. He's the right person to call. So sometimes I call him if somebody has a question about who we should talk to.
So you,
But we really do try and find the right person to answer questions. And we get a broad range of questions.
yeah,
Sometimes we're asked to just, I've had situations where towns have received copies of proposed ANR rules. And just get a call, but well, what does this say? You know, what does this really mean? Because it's very technical, very engineering, whatever. And you know, towns have a range of capacity.
Yes.
I think we know, you know, we have the towns of Stowe and Cambridge, which are larger, but we work with the community of Belvedere
for a water bill.
or Waterville. Exactly, we work with Waterville and those, they have, road commissioners. That's their staff, you know, clerks and road commissioners, and so in those communities, we really function as a community staff.
So you wouldn't, there's not just an immediate, yes, I feel comfortable, I know exactly who to go to when having these questions answered at the state level.
Right, sometimes there is and sometimes there isn't, it depends how esoteric or obscure the question is, so, you know, and in some areas. We have specific state, like in the transportation area, you know, we have, I think, very clear lines of communication. Working with ANR, like we're working on flood hazard bylaws, you know, I know the call Rebecca Pfeiffer.
Okay.
But there are other areas where we have to find out.
Okay, I think the point I'm trying to make, and I saw that we had someone raise their hand out of the corner of my eye who may be able to answer it, but I think the point I'm trying to make is I have some concerns that there isn't an approach to dam safety that is staffed well enough at the state level to actually give you the resource that you need. So it's not, I'm not trying to point out that you are doing something incorrect in your work. I'm trying to say, I don't think it is an obvious person for you. Or perhaps you, yeah, so I guess that's the point I'm trying to.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know.
Mr. Baker.
I'm sorry to interject, and not with regard to dam safety, but I was thinking more about the floodplain rules, like sometimes the conversation goes the other way, where the town has interacted with a state staffer and it is not, it doesn't quite make sense, I'll say it that way, and so lots of times we're playing kind of a mediating role of like kind of following up with the state and the town and trying to get to the right place, so all these conversations don't all happen in one direction. This is all my point.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, anything else that you wanted to mention?
You know, I can't read my handwriting, so that's a problem.
Your notes are very secure.
But no, I really appreciate the opportunity to come in here. I'll work with Charlie on some proposed language, and I super appreciate all of the time and the interest.
We appreciate you. Thank you. You guys are like on the ground, man.
So waiting sometimes.
You're in the water.
Right.
Thanks so much for coming in. Thank you, Mr. Baker.